Research often adds moderators or mediators to prior research and frames that as its contribution. Now let us draw a model with a moderator as well as a model with a mediator and look at the distinction between the two. Let's first draw a main hypothesis between a dependent and an independent variable. Let's say that we take the relationship between the number of days it takes to form a government, a coalition government, and trust in politics. Trust in politics being the dependent variable y, and the days it takes to agree on a coalition government being the x variable. Y is the dependent variable, x is the independent variable. And we draw an arrow between the two to indicate that the relationship runs from the days it takes to form a government to the trust in politics construct. One could also imagine the relationship to go in the other direction. In contexts where trust in politics is low, it may take politicians longer to form a coalition government. And hence, it is important to draw the research model to show clearly what association you have in mind. Is it a bidirectional association? Is it a causal direction? And if so, in which direction does it go? Often we add to such a drawing the hypothesis number involved as well as the sign. You can imagine that if these models become more complex, it helps the reader to understand the development of the model if you can refer back to a visual depiction that indicates which hypothesis fits where and what the expected sign is. So here we expect a negative relationship between the number of days it takes to form a coalition government and subsequent trust in politics. Okay, let us continue to add a moderator. A moderator variable changes a relationship. It is hence a, let's say, variable z that has an effect on the relationship between x and y. If the variable z is present, or if z takes on higher values, the relationship between x and y is more positive, more negative, less positive, or less negative. And I'll show you in a bit what that could graphically look like. So, in the relationship between the number of days it takes to form a coalition government and trust in politics, the presence of an economic crisis, the economic business cycle, is a variable of interest. If we're in a depression, then people expect governments to form quickly because there's urgent things that need to be done. So the effect of the negative effect of the number of days it took a government to form a coalition onto trust in politics is even more negative in cases of a downturn. Now, if you would draw this in an XY plot, so the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable, then you could say that there is a, well, let's take this one, there's a negative relationship between the number of days it takes to form a coalition and trust in politics. And if z is present, so let's say that here it is absent, if it is present, that relationship may become more negative. So it would look a bit like this. The relationship becomes more negative in the presence of the moderator. One could also imagine that the relationship is negative between x and y, but that as a consequence of the presence of a moderator, it becomes less negative, and then it looks like this, or it may even turn into a positive relationship when the moderator is present. Then the sign of the relationship actually changes when the variable is there. We could see this, for example, for an effect where you expect a negative relationship for men and a positive relationship for women. If the relationship in contrast would be positive, the relationship between x and y, then we could also say that the relationship with the moderator present becomes more positive, or it becomes like this, less positive, or may even turn negative. I tend to avoid the word strong and weak in this context. I use more negative, less positive, etc. And that is because strength refers also to the significance of a relationship, and that is an entirely different matter. Hypotheses of the moderation type, I tend to prefer them to be as clear as possible. For example, Z moderates the relationship between x and y such that for higher levels of Z, the relationship between x and y is more negative compared to the case with low levels of Z. That's quite a lot of words to use in hypothesis, but it is exactly clear which of these four graphs you have in mind. If you say instead that Z moderates the relationship between x and y, that merely establishes the form. It says that it has an effect, but it doesn't specify whether that effect is more or less strong. So you can more or less strong. You could say, if we apply this to the trust in politics example, the economic cycle moderates the relationship between days taken to form a coalition and trust in politics, such that for economic downturns, the relationship between days taken to form a government and trust in politics is more negative as compared to a case of economic prosperity. Okay, so that is the moderator. And let me leave the moderator here for a while and introduce to you the mediator. Mediator is a process variable. It comes in between the x and the y variable. You can imagine this as a sequential step where first x happens, that leads to m, and that leads to y. Or you can think of the mediator as the process, the mechanism that explains the relationship between x and y. If you would draw this, then x would lead to some kind of a mediator, let's call that variable m, and m subsequently leads to y. Often, when we estimate this, we also allow for a direct path between x and y. So what explains the relationship? Well, I'm no expert in politics. I can imagine that if it takes longer to form a government, then such governments will be less stable, and less stable governments lead to a lower trust in politics. So there's a variable in between. The instability of governments explain why trust in politics goes down as it takes longer to form new coalitions. So this is the distinction between the mediator and a moderator. A moderator is a variable, often a contextual variable, that affects the relationship, the main effect between two other variables. And the mediator is in between. It explains why x and y are related. In a follow-up video, I'll look into moderated mediation and mediated moderation, two more advanced topics.